identified a number of issues that you wanted to see addressed in our planning. We brought on board SOM. They took your ideas, your key vision elements, and used that as the starting point for our planning effort. Following that, we've met several times at key stages along the master planning process, and you've provided really good input on that. And in fact, after each of our meetings, we've gone back and identified really key and valuable ideas and concepts that you've shared and incorporated them into the next round of our planning. And that will continue. I will say that, we haven't got everything in yet, but are working on it and have made some significant progress. I do want to mention that, as we've reached out, we've looked at, we've tried to get input from a number of groups. And certainly these working groups, you've been around the longest, but we've also reached out significantly to the public through open houses and through surveys, got some really good information from that process. We've got a stakeholder advisory group that has provided us really good information as well. We've also, over the last couple of weeks, through kind of a publicly noticed process, have met with almost 20 different developer groups, because we wanted to put some of these ideas to the real world test and say, all right, if you had to build this, what would you change? Have you identified any fatal flaws? Or are there ways that we can make this a better project? And we've received a lot of good input from that. But I think the point that I want to make there is that really universally, all of them have complemented the input into this process, the ideas that you've provided and presented. And they continue to emphasize that these are ideas that add value. They're ideas that are practical. And while they provided some refinements, I think there is just very, very broad recognition that because we've had so many great minds and community-spirited people working on this, we're getting to a better project than we would have otherwise. So thank you for that. Thanks for your input. In a very real sense, we couldn't get to this point without you. Now there's more to go. We've got a number of steps ahead, but we'll probably continue to call on you from time to time. But if you go away with nothing else, just recognize how much I and our team appreciate your input. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do today. I'm going to turn the time over in a minute to Pete Kindle from SOM, and we'll go through kind of the progress that's been made since we last got together and share with you the ideas that have been incorporated, our efforts to go from a series of alternatives to a preferred alternative. We went from those 3 different concepts to kind of a consolidated concept. We looked at some alternatives within that and are still evaluating those, and are really targeting coming up with a preferred alternative that can be refined ultimately into the master plan or the framework plan that we expect to see within the next couple of months. So after Pete shares that little update, we're going to break out into breakout rooms. We'll let you self-select and go to those areas of most interest to you with some of the subject matter experts and be able to talk in more detail about some of the deliverables that came out of stage 3 and any refinements that you would suggest. So we'll do that and then reconvene briefly, get little reports from each of the breakout rooms, and wrap up for the day. But I think this will be really an important session for us to put a finer touch on some of the ideas that you've presented and you can give us some feedback if we're heading in the right direction or the wrong direction. So any questions with any of that before we move on? Okay, thank you. Then I'll turn it over to Pete.
Great, Alan, thank you. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody, and it's great to be back with you again on behalf of the SOM team and the Point Leadership Group. We really appreciate all the input you've given us so far. So I wanted to start by going back through some of the input we heard last time. And then the second part will be to present the what we're calling the stage 3 framework plans. We have 3 of them, as we did in stage 2. And then happy to take any questions at that point. We also have some detailed studies that I think you might be interested in as part of this. So the input you gave us at the last meeting was really quite critical, as Alan mentioned, to how we've advanced the plan. So this is a summary of some of the things we heard, comments about the architecture to be reflective of Utah, the incorporation of schools, and this idea of a redemptive future use for the prison site, reflecting and incorporating natural ecosystems in the project. Again, this reference to Utah. And there was a lot of comments around the retail model and what would be a traditional response versus the type of response that we want to have in this project, which is really leveraging that retail as an energizer for the whole project. So moving it a bit more into the middle of the project. There's a question about transit from the southwest side of the valley, moving the performance venue closer to the BRT location. And again, what the character is of the retail, this idea of merging public space, hospitality, and entertainment all together with the retail. So it's a much more integrated environment. There's a lot of discussion, of course, about what we're calling the community park. This is a 15 to 20 acre portion of the plan that has been designated or could potentially be designated as a community park that would have active uses in it. But there was a strong desire to make sure that the whatever park we do include in the project is ecologically responsive. And also that it doesn't duplicate or add to the existing significant open space that's along the Jordan River now, but rather has a more purposeful design. The open space system will also include some stormwater management functions. And I think the last bullet point here, you'll recall that we did introduce the idea of 3 development scenarios, one where 60% of the land is developed, one where 55%, and the other where 57.5% is developed. So there was some discussion and continues to be some discussion around what is the appropriate percentage of land that will be developed. But we do know that if we go with the lower percentage, which is still completely reasonable from a commercial standpoint, we can meet the development program regardless of the final percentage. I think there was some appreciation for a new type of development pattern that incorporates ecological systems along with development, bringing these 2 ideas closer together. There's a question about the BRT, if BRT is cost effective. We have adjusted the BRT route, which I'll touch on today, to make it more central to the project and bring it in close to the density and jobs. There's a comment about separation of land uses. One of the important changes we will be moving forward with is to reduce that separation of land uses, to have a slightly more mixed use approach, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. And then the idea of complete streets, and again, density and jobs tied to BRT lines. A few last ones. First bullet point, question about flexibility in the land uses and the phasing, and both I and Steve Kellenberg may touch on the phasing idea today. As Ellen mentioned, there were a lot of conversations with different developers about how to develop the project. And I'll touch on a little bit of that today. We had some interesting feedback, and then guidelines around the development. So these were all really important feedback. School location and how folks will get to school is a concern. We have relocated the school to take it off the main road. So that is a point that we responded to. And then bike connections from offsite to BRT. We have done some additional work on bike routes. Question about the scale of the blocks, and then tie-ins of the roads to offsite properties and road networks. As Ellen mentioned, there was a series of developer interviews that have now begun to inform our planning moving forward. So we wanted to relay that to you today. They gave us 9 primary comments, which have been listed here. So number 1, the plan overall should have a greater mix of housing and office. So as you have commented, the developers also made the comment of mixing uses to some degree, to a greater degree. We still want to have clear identities for each of the districts, but there will be a greater mixing of uses. And by mixing, we mean residential with non-residential functions. Number 2 was the district-based development approach did raise some questions from the development community, whether it makes sense to split the project up into smaller development entities and let different developers develop those entities, or does it make more sense to have a master developer that's partnered with the state who can exert more overall visioning and control on the project? Number 3 was consolidate innovation hub. So this idea really was in response to how we focus our innovation investments. And that may be institutional tenants, institutional investors, or participants in this project. But it may be also companies that want to do a more innovation-focused program or have an innovation mission. We want to bring those people together, whether it's public or private, so that there's a little more energy around the innovation. Number 4 was some comments on the pedestrian priority zone. I think, as you maybe remember, we did have some pedestrian priority zones in the center of the project. These would not be car-free, but they would be pedestrian priority, as the name implies. So the development community just wanted some more thought and development around that idea. One thing that was not seen as viable right now was the idea of satellite parking, or some sort of consolidated parking scheme where parking is provided separate from where the building is located. So there may be an opportunity for that in the future, but they wanted to make sure that the parking provisions are met within a close adjacency to where the development is. Number 6 was the urban core. And we'll share a little bit more information on that today, but the urban core really is the mixed use center of the project. They wanted to see a slightly higher density there and a mix of uses. The entertainment district also the development community thought was important, but perhaps it's a little more modest in size, but would act as an important anchor and activity generator for the project. Number 8 from the developers was on the support retail. These are the smaller retail elements that are out away from the core, so around neighborhood centers or district centers. They just wanted us to be careful that we didn't overcommit on retail in those areas, excuse me. And then finally, housing types. There was general agreement that the early phase should accommodate different densities. I think generally the development community supported a variety of densities, price points, and target markets. And they also suggested that we consider some single family detached housing. So that was the development feedback together with your comments. So stage 3, we just concluded. So I wanted to highlight some of the signature design features of all 3 options. As I mentioned, we did do 3 options in stage 3. They're actually quite similar. There's really just 3 or 4 different components to them. One is the percentage of developable area, which you can see here, 60% on the left and 57.5 on the right, with 55 in the middle. The main driver of that difference is this community park that we talked about in the Northwest. They are all relatively similar in terms of the total square footage. Alternative 1 has 15.5 million, alternative 3 and 2 have 17 million. This creates a fairly consistent floor area ratio, or FAR, meaning the perceived density of the project. So, but more importantly than the differences are actually the things that are common to all 3. So I just wanted to walk you through those right now. So one is this idea of uniquely Utah. We heard that from you last time. We want to make sure the project is specific to this place. We also want it to be an economic catalyst for the Wasatch Front. I think there was general agreement that this project should be a landmark project that has a higher density and higher level of aspiration than typical projects. So that's well included. There's also a comment about the road grid and why we chose the development increment or development parcels that we did. And it really was based on the original Salt Lake grid, which is shown here on the left, or at least the concept behind the Salt Lake grid. That formed an 800 by 800 foot sort of macro structure, and then the development parcels are contained within that. So there is a correlation, again, with this idea of being uniquely Utah, correlation between the physical layout of the plan and Salt Lake history. So we think that's important. It also establishes that porosity and movement through the project. A commitment to conservation, water management and incorporation of wetlands. Of course, the river to range trail, which we've talked about before, this idea of connecting these 2 major physical features in the valley, the river and the range. What we're calling a complete community, which really is a land use planning idea where there are multiple activities happening here that interact around a central core. And that is structured around the notion of a 15-minute city. So everything is within a 15-minute walk of the center. So at its core, this project innovates in the sense of being primarily a bike and pedestrian community, and cars become complementary to that idea. A series of 5-minute districts. All of the schemes have this subdivision of districts. And then some of the program programming elements. So this signature feature of a business and technology hub, over half the land area would be devoted to this goal, this commercial goal, an institutional and research presence, a live-work community where there is a balance of housing and jobs that are in proportion to each other. Innovation accelerators, or focal points in the plan where innovation is highlighted and encouraged. Gold standard bus rapid transit. As I mentioned, we have been working with UTA to refine the BRT route to get that maximized around density and jobs. We've also been talking with UTA about a very innovative circulator in the plan. Again, this is common to all the plans. A retail and entertainment destination, which would be part of the core area. If we choose to go in this direction, a community park at the northwest, a central park, which we've heard about before and talked about, and then pedestrian priority zones, bike and pedestrian linkages. So to make the 15-minute city idea work, this idea of a complete community, strengthening and reinforcing these bike and pedestrian links. And then finally, a community for everyone. So it's a place where families can live, where young people can get their first job, where communities can come and be part of a full and complete community, as exemplified by these smaller amenities and parks that are distributed through the project to add to that livability. And this will all come together in a highly innovative physical fabric that is made up of these four components: streets and mobility corridors, open space, buildings, and our sustainability and smart city strategies. So those are the common elements. Now, I wanted to quickly walk you through the actual alternatives. So this is alternative 1, 60% developable area. Here's the framework plan that you've seen before. The gray represents development area, the green is open space, and the white are roads. You can see the pink or dark red line is the BRT route. And we tried to bring that BRT route right into the core area. In this particular option, it actually skirts the edge of that core area. There would be 2 stations as shown by the white dots. And then the dotted red line indicates a potential pedestrian priority zone. So it's pretty substantial in this option. It would be essentially defined by that loop road. This is the land use plan. You can see in this option, the retail and entertainment is concentrated in the middle. The striped red and black lines indicate retail frontage or potential retail frontage on the ground floor to activate those streets. And of course, blue is office primarily or non-residential, and the yellows and oranges represent residential. So this one is our most separated land uses. You can also see that we've relocated the school site to be directly adjacent to that greenway off of the main street, but still close. The district concept is shown here. So these districts range from 45 acres up to 120 acres. They would have different focuses depending on where they sit in the plan, but generally we're thinking most of these would be mixed use in some way. So that's exciting. And then the retail and district cores are indicated here. So you can see a concentration of retail and other active functions that would serve as a balance for the residential and office, focused around the BRT. So a high degree of accessibility from public transit to this core area. And then the density map shown here. So darker densities indicate, darker colors indicate higher densities. Again, trying to maximize that density around BRT and public transit. And the open space plan in option 1 indicates about 128 acres of open space. You can see the community park in the northwest is not included in this plan. What this means is if we do move forward with a development approach like this with 60% developable, we would lose some of those sports fields, essentially. So people would have to go elsewhere to get that recreation component. There was a comment about external connectivity. This is the road plan. We're trying to and hope to maximize external connections. I think there's about 12 or 14 shown here. There was also a comment from the group about showing the beginnings of some secondary roads inside the larger parcels, which we've indicated with the dotted lines. That's still in progress and something we'll refine in stage 4. And then, as I mentioned, we have spent some time working on the core areas. This gives you a sense of the pedestrian priority zone in that mixed use core. You can see the River to Range Park and the Central Park. And then we're looking at a variety of micromobility and transit options. So the yellow line indicates a potential micromobility or circulator route. We're in discussions about whether that should be a separated route that runs on its own, in its own right-of-way, or whether it's integrated with streets. And we hope to refine that in stage 4. And then this shows the civic and institutional presence in the plan. This is still very much in progress. And as I mentioned, the developers encouraged us to move that institutional use into more of the center of the project. So it activates the adjacent land uses. And then a quick test fit just to really see what the densities are going to look like. So here you can see this simple extrusion and massing of what that GFA might start to look like. Alternative 2 is 55% developable. The difference is that community park now is back in the plan. I do want to emphasize that we can still meet the development targets and GFA targets that we've established, even with that park. The other difference in this concept is that the central park, which you see at the center of the plan, has actually been joined up with the River to Range Trail. So that central park location changed a little bit. And I'll go a little bit faster. The basic concepts are similar, as I mentioned, between the 3 schemes. This one's a little more mixed use. You can see some of that residential migrating eastward into the office district. And based on the developer feedback, we anticipate in stage 4 that will be a little bit more developed. Again, similar road network. This one has a different transit idea. We're also exploring the idea of multiple smaller loops that connect to districts and then link people back to the BRT stations. So the idea is for people that can't walk or choose not to walk, you can jump in a circulator and get to BRT or get to wherever you need to go in the plan. So again, the 3-dimensional view of the 55% developable scheme. There you can see that park in the northwest and the central park here in the center, linking to that River to Range Trail. And then option 3 is 57.5% developable. The difference again is primarily there's a little smaller community park to the northwest. So a little more development area here. We can still meet a lot of the active recreation goals with this concept. Alternative 3 has the most direct BRT alignment. So you can see it's actually coming straight through the central area, and then it turns north and leaves the project. So we would appreciate some comments on that today. The advantage of that is you do get a more direct and centralized BRT route, but also there may be some conflicts with the use of the Central Park and the River to Range Park with that piece of infrastructure running through the center. But again, we can meet the development goals without any issue on all 3 options. So it's a question really then of whether the park, what's the preferred park system. This one also demonstrates a fairly high degree of mixing of uses, probably the most of all 3. You can see that there's about 6 or 8 parcels in the core area that have been converted to residential. So that's in line with what the development community, and I think some of you have asked for. Again, an idea of slightly more mixed use, dispersed retail model, but still a commitment to that core area with the core retail right there in the middle. In terms of transit and micromobility, again, a loop system, this would run on existing or planned roads. So this would be a shared roadway idea where the mobility vehicle would run on a shared street. And then I just wanted to touch on a few studies we did on the core area as well as the open space. I'll take about 5 more minutes, Alan, if you don't mind. The open space planning has also been advanced in stage 3. This shows a diagram of the types of open space that we're thinking of. You can see the signature open space, of course, is the River to Range Park. This would be a more naturalized environment, but could also take certain programming. So you could have some informal soccer fields there. You could have other types of active recreational uses there. So this drawing shows in this brightest green color what we call active programming. So these are sports fields, volleyball courts, basketball courts, baseball fields. You can see that predominantly that's focused in this community park to the northwest, but there's also room in the neighborhood parks and in the River to Range Park for certain activities like that. So we can accommodate many activities in these other spaces. In terms of the programming of the River to Range Park, we've divided it into 4 segments, what we call the delta or the low end towards the Jordan River, to the activated uplands or the high end towards I-15. And then we have 2 other areas in between. And each of these can be programmed in different ways. And I think that's what's really exciting about this park, is it not only touches the entire project, but also can serve many, many functions. So one of those primary functions is to move and convey stormwater through the project. This will save money on below-grade infrastructure. It also creates potential for naturalized habitat recreation, but it also allows what we call programmed edges. So outside of that central stormwater management zone, there could be, again, these active spaces for children's play areas and events like that. So we have begun to do some very informal programming of how this might work. So you can see the orange lines are pathways, and the darker green colors are these more active spaces. So this gives you a sense of the types of activities that could occur in there, and then just a few images of what things might look like. And as you move more to the center of the project, so the school again would be in this gray zone here. That's the school parcel. So you can see that kids could get right on these orange pathways and walk wherever they needed to go. But not only that, have direct access to this natural system and play areas that would be, I think, really complementary to that school function. We want the landscape to reflect Utah, to reflect the ecosystems and plant communities that are native to this part of the valley. So that'll be consistent throughout the whole park. As you move more to the middle, this is, again, that core area, that mixed use core. Here are the prison buildings down at the bottom, the 3 historic prison buildings. So you can see some of the programming ideas in this central area. And then finally at the top, adjacent to I-15, this could be a more programmed area, maybe a little less natural because of the proximity to the highway and some of those influences, but could be very well suited to maybe a more active program. So those are the 3 alternatives with a little bit of an overview to the open space. And Ellen, I'm happy to leave it there. If you'd like, I could go into the detailed planning for the core area if you'd like to spend another 5 minutes.
Yeah, let's just touch on that quickly.
Okay.
Pete.
Yeah, I think it's.
We want to get to discussion, but I think that's an important piece for people to understand.
Right. So one of the really important parts of the project is the core area. This is not only the geographic center of the site, but the spiritual center of what we hope is the spiritual center of the project. This is the most mixed use. It's the highest density. It's where the River to Range Park meets the Central Park. It's where the retail will be. So really important spot in the plan. So we've actually done 3 versions of this. The first one is a low density core. We tried to find an analog. This is Kierland Commons in Scottsdale to give you a sense of the height of the buildings and kind of the types of functions that might be here. Probably most of you have been to a place like this. These are pretty active mixed use environments. Some of them have a high housing component, some of them don't, but they're great places to meet friends and high energy activities that will serve all the uses in this master plan. So here you see an enlargement on the right of that core area. The main boulevard is this gray line that comes up the left side of this drawing. The BRT route you can see has been shown in the pink dotted line with the 2 pink dots representing the stops. Yellow is residential, blue is office, and red is retail. The purple is more of an innovation R&D type function. So we see the core areas being, again, highly mixed use. And this gives you a sense of the scale of the project. This is 72 acres, the parcels that are shown here. This is a 12-story building, this yellow one right here. So these are big development areas. But I think what's really exciting is the mix of uses in this core area, the ability for it to accommodate a lot of exciting types of development, and the proximity of these different functions will really generate a lot of excitement and energy as part of the core of the project. This would be about 2.5 million square feet of development, which is shown here. And then we've also started some very early programming of the Central Park. So these are just really just some very early ideas about what might be included in here, and some very simple ideas about how that might be arranged. But we want to have performance space, event lawns, some activities, some dining. You can see the BRT station at the north edge. And then these green lines indicate pedestrian connections from different parts of the plan. So also exciting. And just as a reminder for option one, alternative one, that Central Park is the furthest away from the river to range. So it's actually its own distinct space, and that would touch the BRT line to the north. Option two is what we called our high density core. The analog that we looked at is a place called Reston Town Center in Virginia. This has a very high, relatively high density, tall buildings. Here is the plan. So this aligns with option two for the master plan. Here, the Central Park has been connected directly to the river to range park. So you can see that it's no longer linked to the BRT station. You would have to walk a little bit to get to that Central Park. However, there's potential benefits for being connected to river to range for larger events, for instance, or other types of programming where there might be a lot of people. So in this design option, the BRT comes in and would go up the edge of the park, and then it would turn left onto the boulevard and then exit to the north. But other than that, the land use assignments are approximately the same. Yellow represents residential, blue office, of course. And here you can see more mixing. So you can see residential on top of red, which is retail, blue on top of red. So this is a more complex but very appropriate development model that a lot of folks are looking at today, this idea of mixing uses on a site. And you may be seeing some of this in the Salt Lake area today. This is about 5.3 million square feet of GFA. So just for reference, that's almost a third of the total GFA of the project. So this high density model does accommodate and can absorb a lot of development. And I think one of the components we're going to look at in stage 4 is to allow the core to respond to market demand. So the density may actually go up if the project really becomes successful. The park layout, again, this is not a design, it's just really a test fit of different types of programming that we might put in here. And alternative 3 is what we call the medium density core. The analog is Woodlands Town Center. So here you can see retail at the base of these buildings. There might be some office or residential above. You can see the building heights are generally 3 to 4 stories. Maybe 1 or 2 of them goes up a little higher than that. Real commitment to public space. And that, of course, is consistent with what we're trying to do at the point. And as I said earlier, in option 3, BRT would come almost directly through the core area. So here you see that alignment. The retail cluster is to the left. The remainder of the development would be mixed use, residential and office. And in 3 dimensions, this is what that starts to look like. The BRT right-of-way is shown to the appropriate scale. That would be about 40 feet wide. So one of the challenges would be how to make sure that the Central Park and River to Range Park are not overly impacted by that BRT route. This one's kind of interesting because we do have that direct adjacency between the retail on the left and the park on the right. This is probably the most unique layout of the three. So these are the three core areas. And then one last test fit I wanted to share with you today. We are making sure that the office layouts that we're showing in the framework plan actually do work and accommodate real buildings and real parking structures. We have enlarged the grid a little bit in the office district because current demand for office warrants larger buildings than you might find for residential or retail areas. But this gives you a sense of the scale and type of the buildings that would go into these office environments. We want to have a strong commitment to, of course, landscape and ground plane and shared space, what we call active ground levels. So this is the northeast quadrant of the plan. And one of the challenges we had, in addition to the building scale, was the parking accommodation. According to current demand, the parking requirements are pretty substantial. You can see that buffer to I-15 that is part of the master plan. What we call Wasatch Park or Wasatch Square would be the central park for this area, the district park. And you also may notice that we've clustered the parking structures in a way that they are screened from the primary open spaces by buildings. So you don't see the parking structures as much as possible from the primary streets. And then we can further screen those architecturally or with landscaping. Here you see a three-dimensional model of that core area, the Wasatch Park and Wasatch Square. The smaller buildings would be research, R&D, special functions that are adjacent to the park. The larger blue buildings would be corporate office. And then the Ps indicate parking, of course. The other challenge that we wanted to look at was, how do you aggregate parcels together? So if a user comes in with, say, wanting 1 million square feet of office, how would we do that? So the red dotted line indicates about 1 million square feet. So you might have one user that takes 3 or 4 parcels, but we would require them to design the project in a way that's consistent with the principles that you see here, this idea of public space, screening, parking. So here's a view from a little further out. You can see that South Brt station to the left. 5-minute walk is in the first dotted line. 10-minute walk is in the second dotted line. So even from the South Brt station, you can see about 2/3 of this district would be within a 10-minute walk of BRT. So that's fantastic. We've indicated 3 potential campus groupings of buildings, each around 1 million square feet. So lots of possibilities, and we're comfortable that this block size works. Works for this parcel. So I think I'll leave it there, Ellen, and open it up to any questions. And then if there are none, we can go to the working groups.
Great, thanks, Pete. That's good information. I think one of the things we've tried to convey is that we've received a lot of input. Frankly, not all of it consistent, and trying to balance everything's not easy, but hope you've seen that, given it careful consideration, and are starting to incorporate things into the plan. Not done. We also mentioned that we've received a lot of feedback from other sources, the development community, the public, and others. And so there's some refinements that need to be made. But wanted to see if you've got some questions or comments for the full group before we head into our breakout sessions. Commissioner Wolstenhume, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. And Peter, if you could just address, it looks like you've added a little bit more space for public education in this round. Could you talk about the size as far as acreage for that, and if that's going to be an adequate amount of space for our public education?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I knew you were going to ask how big that parcel was. I don't have the precise acreage right now. I'll try and get it to you before the end of the meeting, but I believe it would be at least approximately 5 acres, if not a bit more than that. But let me see if I can get that number for you.
Okay, and have you had a chance, I assume you've had a chance to meet with the superintendent, with the school district surrounding that, with the number of houses and population that would increase in that, if we feel like, or they feel like that's going to be an adequate amount to take care of the children as they come in with public education needs.
Yeah, we have had one set of meetings with the surrounding school districts. We're trying to schedule a second one, but because of the end of the school year, it's been a little hard to schedule. So we're anticipating in the next week or so, we'll have a detailed meeting on that parcel in particular, how it lays out, what the precise programming would be for the school. So we hope to cover all that in the next week or two.
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Reed, you've got your hand up too.
Thank you, Alan. I think you guys have done a superb job. I'd like to live and work in any of those alternatives. So I really like this. I'm going to bring up a couple things that came up before with questions, and then support one idea that came up in your talk with the development community. So I assume that this means that the idea of a third BRT station was eliminated from consideration. And I think that in the last meeting, I don't know if it was the whole group or the working group or whatever. I thought when you think of BRT as light rail, rubber tired light rail, there would be room for a third northwestern BRT station. And if you think about 400 South, or you think about North Temple, the spacing of stations would allow you to have it seems to me, a third BRT station, which would nicely complement the other two. Second point is, I didn't bring this up, but I did put it in the chat last time, that in these pedestrian priority zones, I think you want, as part of your plan, a very heavy traffic calming component. I mean, you're not going to eliminate the automobile. It's not going to be eliminated, but traffic calming was part of planning in Salt Lake City until about 2003, and it's back. And I'm talking about raised intersections and raised crosswalks and bulb outs and chokers and median islands that narrowed the right of way and so on. It's just super, super important for creating these walkable places, which is the idea of the pedestrian priority zone. The third is a question. I assume that we've eliminated the possibility of a couplet rather than a 6-lane arterial, or it would have come up in the conversation, and I'm okay with that. But I thought it would be an interest. This is going to be incredibly innovative. It'd be an interesting thing to test. Ryan Hale.
Reed, thank you.
Yeah. And last thing, and then I'm done. I like the idea of having some single family housing, which apparently was a point that the developers made to you. and I know you're trying to create dense mixed-use development, but if you think of an Orenco station, or you think of a Baldwin Park or Rancho Santa Margarita, they all have some single family, and what that creates is a complete community where you can life cycle community, where you can move from your apartment to your starter home, maybe a condo, and then ultimately when you have kids, you can move to a single family detached, and when you retire, you can kind of reverse the order of moves, so you end up in a condo or something. So I like that a lot, even though it costs you density. Again, if you think of those examples I mentioned, they all have single family. Thank you.
Yeah, and Reed, maybe I could just make a few points quickly. First of all, yeah, at the last meeting, Representative UTA opened the door to the potential of a third station, and I had a little further conversation with her this last week, and it's at least on the table and open for further discussion. With respect to the traffic calming in the pedestrian priority zones, yes, no question about it. That's pretty key. And the third piece on the couplet, you can see Pete's putting up an idea here. We have been looking at that, continue to study it. The SOM team put together some pros and cons, and have been exploring some different plans and designs. So I'd say the fact that you don't see it on the last draft doesn't mean it won't be in the next one. We're actively looking at ways that we could make that function without creating kind of a dead space in between, and more barriers to pedestrian crossing. But at the same time, it can create some opportunities for traffic flow and interesting spaces. And then, yeah, I think we're looking to build a community that has housing and facilities for a range of lifestyles and people at different stages of their life cycle. And so appropriate single family is not off the table either. So you've identified a number of things that are important and still very much under consideration. So thanks.
Thank you.
And Pete, did anything you wanted to add to that quickly, or did we cover it?
Yeah, I think, Reed, thank you. Yes, as Alan mentioned, we are in the process of looking at the couplet. This was our first pass at it, and we have communicated some advantages and disadvantages of it to a client group, to Alan and Steve. So that is underway, and I think we'll be able to make a decision on it probably in the next couple of weeks. We're going to do a little more detailed design to really understand the impacts. And just for everyone's information, this represents a split of the main boulevard into two one-way roads that would be a little bit smaller in scale. And the idea there is to reduce the potential barrier that larger boulevard may create between the two sides of the plan.
If I could just jump in for, Reed, we were just looking at this yesterday and looking at analogs, around the country, including at Daybreak, which has one of the, I think one of the better, implementations of the couplet. So the main thing is to minimize the amount of inefficiency that's created, by the taper. So I think we'll be probably relooking at this geometry and seeing if we can get it more efficient and see what the width needs to be between the two sides. But the whole idea is to break down the scale of the street so it's a little bit more pedestrian friendly. I'd also add that we're working on this phase 1 programming right now, and we definitely have, we're recommending single family detached, so higher density single family detached, but still detached nonetheless in the first phase.
So let me just jump in because we want to get to these breakout rooms so everybody has a chance to participate. But it looks like Thor, you've got a question. Maybe we can take that and then we'll head into our breakouts.
Yeah, I'll be really brief, and then we can discuss this more in the breakout rooms. But I think some key things, the things that jumped out to Reed were also the things that jumped out to me immediately. But two other things I wanted to mention were, I believe also the developer comments were also very, accurate, and we need to take those into account. And one of the things I didn't see in all three scenarios was that mix of residential into each of the districts, which appeared to be recommended by the developers. And then the one other point I want to make sure that we highlight is that, we should also be taking into consideration the regional role that this location is going to serve. And I say that because in particular, we are anticipating in the state significant amount of funding for infrastructure coming from the federal government. And I know that within the state, there have already been some conversations about how to deploy that capital relative to some of our new technologies, those related to, electrification for transportation infrastructure. And so I won't really dive into the particulars of what it appears that we should be anticipating as far as additional transit options and connectivity to the region might go. But I think that, those transportation issues and how we connect to the surrounding area is also going to have significant impact on some of the decision-making on the issues that we're discussing in this meeting.
Yeah. No, those are great points. And as I said, we've heard loud and clear about more mixing of the uses, more residential into the office, and you'll see that in the next round. And no question that regional infrastructure is key. We've had some good conversations with the legislature about how some of the funding could be used to create solutions to some of the regional challenges. I think you're right on. And in fact, was participated in a meeting this morning with the point of the Mountain Development Commission looking at the broader transportation infrastructure needs and how they might be able to help advance that. So thank you. Wonderful points all. Really good questions. Okay, so I think for about the next, let's say 40, 45 minutes, we have an opportunity to jump into these breakout rooms and have a little more robust discussion. We've got 4 rooms and you'll be able to access them, I hope, on our Zoom at the bottom there. But one is on transportation, one is on environment and air quality, the third is land use and economic development, and the fourth is kind of public and stakeholder feedback. That one's going to focus a little bit more on some of the results of the survey that we're just kind of wrapping up now. I thought some of the elected officials and others might be interested in hearing what the public had to say about particular elements of the plan and how we might proceed. So, Muriel, I don't see the breakout room box at the bottom of the screen. Leah?
We can open that up now, Alan.
Okay, you can do that. Let's do it. You'll see down there at the bottom right, 4 squares, breakout rooms. Go in there, pick the room that you want to be in, and feel free to move from one to the other. You're not stuck in any one. You can rove and comment on a number of issues. So we'd invite you to do that.
Hey, Colton, I know you assigned me, but now it's not letting me select myself. Can you put me in stakeholder feedback?
Yeah, I'll put you in there 1 sec.
You did, and I went, and then it didn't work. So.
Weird.
Yeah, so we'll have subject matter experts that can give you more information and respond to questions in any of those groups.
Colton, I need to do the same thing, go into the stakeholder feedback. It wouldn't, when I clicked on it, didn't send me there.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yep. Huh.
Oh,
Okay.
nice, huh?
Yeah. Let me figure this out though. I'll get you guys in there.
I'm gonna leave and come back.
Okay, that might work.
And the other one is and oh, sorry, we got
Looks like we all got bumped back into the main session.
Oh,
Yeah, that was weird.
That was weird.
who
Can
hit
we
the
try
red
again?
button?
Looks like we need
Yes,
that
go ahead and
breakout
try again.
back at the bottom of the screen again.
it looks like, there we go.
There we go.
I was going to say that was pretty short session.
Mhm.
Welcome back. I missed you. Let's get back together. Thanks. I have the advantage that I was able to float a little bit and get to each of the discussions. They were robust and substantive, and a lot of very good information shared. Exactly what we needed. I think you're to the point now where we're not hearing just generalities, but this has been a group that from the beginning has given specific ideas and feedback, and that really makes a difference. It's much more actionable. So it's one of the reasons that these working group meetings are frankly my favorites. I really appreciate the time that we have. Okay, we've got a little bit of time. I think it's always valuable to get a sense for what some of the other groups talked about if you were not able to get into each of the rooms. So we'll ask the facilitators from each of the groups to just give some of the high points or key ideas that came out of your discussion that you can share. So let's start with the transportation group. So Ryan or Mark, you want to give a quick summary?
Ryan, I think you're on mute. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize coming back into the main room I was muted, but yeah, we had some great discussion. I really appreciate all the comments that we had. Mayor Timothy brought up a couple of items and really talking about drilling down and understanding where the traffic is going to and coming from. Certainly some projects that are adjacent and in their city, the 146 South, really looking forward to hearing more about that and the micro mobility and, you know, how many people are turning left and what do the intersections look like? What are the connection points? And so I think that was some great comments and some great thought, kind of looking at that traffic and where it goes. We talked about the couplet for a little bit, talked about how it's the daybreak version of that is a good comparable, is what most people in the group felt, and that maybe on both ends where they've got a roundabout, it was a good way to transition between the two couplets. In the couplet rendition that we have, there's kind of a sharp point on both ends. And the discussion was that if a roundabout could be incorporated, certainly acknowledging, and there was comments as well, you know, not to put the roundabout on 146 South, but just to really look at that connectivity. And then we also had some discussion about electronic wayfinding and looking at, you know, parking and deliveries and, you know, ways to look at some of that with a mobility app that could be handheld and people could find parking very quickly. There was a discussion very quickly on the undercrossing of Porter Rockwell and how the River to Range Trail would go underneath Porter Rockwell and how that would be a good idea to keep those separated and keep the people moving on the trail system, River to Range. Anything else that you would add, Josh or Mark?
Yeah, some discussion on mobility hubs. We showed a map of potential locations for those. We had shown a major one at one BRT station, and the thought was maybe we could incorporate it at both BRT stations. And then also with the BRT stations, we talked about, you know, potential third station. The spacing needs to work out between the stations, so we'll have to look at that closer to make sure they're spaced far enough apart so it's still an efficient system. So.
Excellent. Again, good feedback that we will take to heart. Okay, let's go to the environment and air quality group. Saki and Pete, you want to provide a little summary?
Yeah, I can give a little summary. We had a really nice discussion, touched on about 8 items. The first one was kind of the decision-making process moving forward, how we process these different alternatives and what decisions will be made in the next couple of weeks to move into stage 4. So we talked about some of the big decision points. We talked about a lot about the open space character, who would manage it potentially, that Salt Lake County would have an interest potentially in seeing this as more of a regional park, which would take some of the burden off of the city of Draper in terms of the management of it. A lot of some discussion around how to connect to commuter rail, and the idea that could commuter rail be anticipated in the future to come into the site, or could it be undergrounded to enhance that connection to the Jordan River? Or should the plan simply accommodate a future connection to BRT as it exists today? So I think those were all really interesting points. Discussion on electrification and the idea that where large-scale projects are moving today is really away from gas completely and towards entirely electric power for all aspects of the development. So we'll try and relay some of that to our sustainability group and make sure that those ideas show up in the next round of not only planning, but design guidelines as well. The last thing we talked about was water-wise landscaping. I think everyone appreciated the fact that we're bringing the water management vision closer in alignment with the realities of what's happening in Utah today. The need to be careful with how we allocate water use, using drought-tolerant species, that the project should be a prototype for best practices around water use. And that would also need to show up in our design guidelines. And then finally, there's a question about whether water rights for this development have been secured at this point, or what the process is for establishing those rights and where that water would come from. So Corey, or Alan, I don't know if you want to update that group on where that stands.
Maybe I can quickly give an overview of that. Don't have all the answers yet, but the existing operations at the prison have some water rights associated with them. As part of the broader adjudication, they're being reviewed, and there's some question about the extent of those rights. But I think there's an expectation that the rights currently associated with the prison would be available for the point. With respect to just providing water in general, that would likely come through Draper City under contract with Jordan Valley Water. And those conversations are well underway, and they've kind of indicated that the water's available, and we just need to kind of figure out the best way to convey that. So. All right. Thank you very much. Again, really good input from our team on environment and air quality. The next one was land use and economic development. Steve and Justin, you're kind of leading that discussion. You want to give us a little?
We had a robust discussion. We focused initially on sort of the urban core, and we looked at the three alternative configurations, and I think there was a sort of leaning towards one of the specific alternatives in terms of the configuration of the Central Park and how it relates to the the linear park, and alternative 3 was thought to be the most interesting and have the best relationship. We also talked a little bit about how to create a more cohesive, connected urban core, and maybe consider narrowing the river to range greenway into a little bit tighter configuration as it goes through the core, so that uses can connect and be a little bit more synergistic. We also talked a lot about the school, and I think, want to make sure that it's right-sized, that it has sufficient capacity, that it doesn't force students off-site into other schools, and to a degree that's not necessary. We talked about sharing open space and play facilities for the school within the river to range corridor, to try and create some more efficiency on the site, but yet again make sure that there's plenty of room that's adequate for the students. We talked about phasing and where phases, some different options on where the first phase could be. We also, had some input on even though the developers were trying to or suggested more multi-use in the various districts, that not get too carried away with that and have isolated housing or end up with all the districts being the same because they all have the same mix of uses. And the last piece, which I think was important, was about the BRT stations, and sort of some comments that maybe we're not quite there yet, in terms of the density and land use patterns should be really self-evident around the BRT stations. There should be higher density. There should be mixed use. Those should really read on the diagrams, and it could be stronger from that standpoint. And there should be some urban open space, associated with those, so that there's a real kind of place there at each of those stations. And so there's probably a little bit of work to do on that in the plan. But I'd say those are the highlights. If anybody in my group thinks I missed anything, feel free to speak up.
Great, thank you. Good summary. And then we also had the public and stakeholder feedback group that went through the preliminary results of the public survey that is underway right now. Who wants to report on that one?
Yeah, so we discussed kind of some of the preliminary survey results that were just hot off the press. And some of the things that really rose to the top in our respondent preferences were to have entertainment options that provide activities for all age groups. A live performance venue was a top ranked priority for respondents. We also discussed how the public was really looking for Utah-based retail on the site, things that are uniquely Utah. And it's fairly intuitive. They also wanted outdoor dining and cafes. We chatted also about, the fact that via the survey, the public said they wanted medium-sized parks. Of course, we have parks planned for the site. They may not be the 5 to 10 acres, but by and large, a lot of the respondent feedback synced fairly well with our current planning efforts. For transit, we talked about how respondents ranked a trolley as their #1 option, but how sometimes you have to take those results with a grain of salt, because the picture that we accompanied the trolley option looked like the UTA track system. That's what people are kind of familiar with. For street character, folks really wanted to see Green Street with landscaping and infrastructure, and ranked very low, prioritizing high capacity roadways that put vehicles over people. So I think that was interesting. Across the board, respondents wanted to see educational programs, not only for K through 12, but adult and vocational educational programs, and housing targeted for people from all walks and stages of life. Sustainability practices that, again, we're already kind of planning for. Some of the feedback we heard from our working group members were questions about how to pay for extensive open space, parks and trails. So that's something that we should keep top of mind. And then also how we're proactively planning for a future focused site when we don't necessarily know exactly the type of people that might be there in 20 years, right? So keeping some built-in flexibility to accommodate changes in consumer preferences. So kind of, I thought it was a really good point from our working group members that the responses we've gotten from Utahns are exactly that, like Utahns who currently live here. But let's make sure that we're thinking also about what people may want in the site in years to come.
Great input, all. Thank you. As always, I come away from these meetings enlightened with some new ideas or new refinements to what we're doing. So thank you for that. Thanks to our planning team at SOM. These guys are just working around the clock to keep up with the difficult pace and responding to a lot of input, and they've just done it really professionally and very well. As we've said, we recognize that there's a little additional work to be done. We will continue on that vein, and over the next couple of months, hope to come together with a framework plan that can, it's not going to be all things to all people. We've said that from the beginning. Nobody's going to get everything he or she wants. But at the end of the day, I think we can have something that meets a lot of needs, that is really thinking about the broad community and trying to accomplish as much as we can within the framework and the resources that are available. So I said at the beginning that this is the last of our scheduled working group meetings. That's what we had on the plan from the beginning. But we've been thinking there may be some value, and would like your input on it, if we bring you all together again and share with you the near final or final framework plan before it goes out to the public. We think that you've been in the trenches, you've worked on this, you've given your time and ideas, and if you'd be interested, we would bring you back again and give you a preview before it goes out publicly. And probably do the same with our stakeholder advisory committee. Is that something you'd be interested in, or do you just want your time back?
This is Sarah Wright. I would be interested and would appreciate that. That's really great to offer that.
I'm seeing some nods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interested.
Interested. Okay. We will work to schedule a time. We were kind of looking at a date, but I see there's potential conflict there. So anyway, we'll spend some time with trying to identify a date pretty soon, get it on your calendars. That'll give you an opportunity to come back, and you'll have all this great information before your friends do. You'll want to call them up and say, if only you knew what I knew, and all that. So,
Yeah.
Thanks again. Anything else that you want to share before we wrap up in the last minute or so? Okay. All right. Thanks. You've been great. This will be different and better because of you. So take care.